Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are around the world, and welcome to this Facebook and YouTube live stream hosted by young professionals in Foreign Policy Brussels, entitled Partners with Benefits, NATO's Enhanced Opportunities Program. This event is the first in YPFP's NATO series, co-sponsored by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization through its Public Diplomacy Division. I'm looking forward to the discussion with our speakers and with all of you who are joining us online. Partners are part of many of NATO's core activities, from building defense capacity to developing interoperability and managing crises. In 2014, NATO granted tailor-made enhanced opportunities for deeper practical cooperation with 5 partners: Australia, Jordan, Finland, Georgiy, and Sweden. Ukraine was recognized as a 6th Enhanced Opportunities Partner in June 2020. Our focus is to dive into the challenges and benefits of this program of cooperation, also known under the abbreviation of EOP, for both the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and 2 of its key NATO partners, part of the program, Sweden and Ukraine. With me today, I have 3 distinguished speakers. James Mackey, Director for Security Policy and Partnerships in the Political Affairs and Security Policy Division at NATO headquarters. Before assuming this position, James served as head of the Office of Euro-Atlantic and Global Partnership in the same division, where he was responsible for overseeing NATO's relationship with partner countries in Western Europe, the Western Balkans, the South Caucasus, Central Asia, the Asia-Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, James.
Thank you very much.
Axel Wernhoff, Ambassador of Sweden to NATO since 2018. His recent positions have been as Ambassador of Sweden to Norway, Consul General in the Consulate General of Sweden in Jerusalem, and Deputy Head of the Department for European Union Affairs in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Sweden. Welcome to you, Ambassador. And Mr. Georgiy Tolkachov, Chargé d'Affaires, Mission of Ukraine to NATO. Before taking up this post in February 2020, Mr. Tolkachov served as head of the Euro-Atlantic section in the Directorate General for the EU and NATO, and as head of the NATO section in the Directorate General for International Security in the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. Thank you for joining us today as well. My name is Cristiana Lavinia Bădulescu, and I'm the co-managing director of the Brussels chapter at YPFP. A couple of in-house guidelines from my side before starting the discussion. Each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will open up for questions and answers. We welcome as many questions so that it becomes a dialogue among ourselves. If you wish to ask a question to our panel or a particular speaker, you can use the Facebook and YouTube live stream to share your questions with the speakers. Simply type them in the sidebar of the event, and I will do my very best to incorporate them all during the Q&A session at the end. Feel free to ask questions at any point, but know that they will not be shared until after the speaker's remarks. Please state your name, affiliation, and location ahead of your question, because we are keen to hear from people in a variety of locations to enrich our discussion today. If the question is for a particular speaker, please specify and please keep it brief so we can get as many as possible. And if you like to interact on social media, please use the hashtag YPFPNATO series. As I said in the beginning, the list of designated EOP countries remains small, comprising only 6 partner countries who have taken forward this program of cooperation with NATO in a tailor-made manner in areas of mutual interest for both NATO and the partner concerned. With these introductory remarks in mind, I will now give the floor to James Mackey, who will walk us through the EOP from a NATO perspective while highlighting both its benefits and its challenges. James, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thanks very much to Young Professionals in Foreign Policy for organizing this event. I think in terms of talking about the Enhanced Opportunities Partner status, I think it's important to also take maybe at first a step back and talk about NATO's partnerships in general. NATO has had partnerships since 1994. And what NATO has done through those partnerships has been to build mutually beneficial relationships with partner countries. So NATO gets something out of the deal, and the partner gets something out of the deal. NATO gets to have access to partners who share our values, partners who want to work with us on security issues around the world, and the partner gets access to NATO training, gets access to political consultations with NATO, and this is something that we've done for over 25 years now. But NATO's partnership evolves over time. In the 1990s, a lot of our partnership work was focused on preparing countries who were partners at that time, but they wanted to become members of NATO. And so we had a lot of work that focused on preparing countries specifically for membership. In the early 2000s, NATO engaged in a number of operations and missions, and a lot of countries wanted to work with us in those operations and missions. And we had at one point in our Afghanistan mission, we had 130,000 troops deployed to Afghanistan from close to 50 countries were contributing troops. And that sort of very brief background sets the stage for the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership, which we're going to talk about this evening. So NATO was in Afghanistan for, or has been in Afghanistan for over a decade. But in the last several years, I guess maybe 4 or 5 years ago, we saw that the mission in Afghanistan was beginning to draw down. NATO reduced its numbers, the partners also reduced their numbers. But what we wanted to do is make sure that we didn't lose the ability to work together, because there are a lot of lessons that we had to learn the hard way about how do your troops work together effectively? How do you make sure that you're able to operate in peacekeeping missions together? Because we might have to do it again in the future. And so the allies at NATO really wanted to focus on making sure that we retained the interoperability with partner countries. And interoperability is just sort of a NATO word for, can you work together? Do you have the ability to talk to each other? Do you have the ability to communicate via the right radios? Do you have the ability to operate in the field together? So for NATO, it's very important to focus on this interoperability because, as I said, that's what allows us to work together with partner countries when we want to, when the partner wants to, and when NATO wants to. Each side has to agree that they want to work together. It's a voluntary measure. So as NATO was thinking about drawing down its operation in Afghanistan, there was a real awareness that we had so much experience that we had gained from working with partner countries. We didn't want to lose that experience. And so we launched an initiative called the Interoperability Initiative. And we had approximately 50% of our partners who joined that initiative, so about 20 countries, who said, yes, we want to work closely with NATO to make sure that we can keep working together in the future. And that's great. We really value the contributions that all of those countries make. But I think that there was a real recognition among the NATO allies that there were a certain group of countries who had really made significant contributions to our operations. They had given us large numbers of forces. They had contributed to most, if not all, of our operations. The forces that they had given us were of very high quality. And so there was a recognition among the allies that for this particular group of countries, we really wanted to give them a different status or a special status, which allowed them to pursue that goal of interoperability with NATO. And so we selected 5 countries initially, and then we added, as you mentioned in your introduction, we added Ukraine just in June of this year as the 6 countries who the NATO allies believe make a really significant contribution to NATO operations and missions. And I would say that the Enhanced Opportunities Partnership, while we say it's a program, it actually winds up being different for each partner country. So NATO has a principle of self-differentiation and also flexible, tailor-made partnerships. And so what NATO has done is they've said to each of these countries individually, we appreciate the contribution you've made. We want to figure out how to work with you better in the future, make sure we keep that interoperability. And so let's tailor make a program for you that's going to meet your needs and meet NATO's needs. And so with each of the 5 and now 6 partner countries, we have worked to create a tailor-made program that allows that country to make sure that it retains its interoperability with NATO. And as I said, it's to make sure that we continue to be able to work together in the future, because we don't know when we might have international peacekeeping operations in the future where we might want to operate together. Now, I won't go into a huge amount of detail because I'm sure that my colleagues from Sweden and Ukraine want to talk about the specifics of their program. But just to give you an overview, to make it a little bit concrete of what does this look like in practice. Well, for instance, in the case of Sweden, we have regular political consultations on Baltic Sea security. It's a space that we share with Sweden and also with Sweden's neighbor Finland. And so we have regular consultations on the situation in the Baltic Sea region to be able to exchange our perspectives of what's happening in the security region, the security realm there. We also work to make sure that we have exercises together as often as possible. And so we regularly sit down with our Swedish counterparts and talk about what are the exercises NATO has coming up, which are the ones that Sweden wants to participate in. And actually, in return, Sweden has invited NATO allies to participate in Sweden's exercises as well. And so, in general, we try and find the best ways to be able to work together. And then finally, one example I can give with Sweden is we try and maintain political dialogue. And just to give an example, last week, Foreign Minister Linde met with the North Atlantic Council. And so with Sweden, it's a very robust series of dialogue at the political level, and making sure that that's underpinned by practical cooperation to make sure we can work together. In the case of Ukraine, as I said, Ukraine is the newest member of the Enhanced Opportunities Club, so we're still exploring how we can use this status to further deepen NATO-Ukraine relations. Ukraine already has a very deep partnership with NATO and has access to a very wide range of tools. So what we do with enhanced opportunities for Ukraine is actually in large part going to be incremental change rather than revolutionary change. Because we already do a huge amount with Ukraine. We have a very strong and robust partnership with Ukraine. What we're looking at specifically with regard to Ukraine is how do we make sure that we have a strong program of joint exercises? How do we make sure that we keep discussion of Black Sea security issues high on the list? It's an area we've explored with Georgia previously, but with Ukraine, we intend to have a lot of discussion about how we can work together on security issues in the Black Sea region. And also, we're going to be looking very closely and working with our Ukrainian colleagues to see how we can ensure that the training that Ukraine is providing for its armed forces is the same as NATO forces are receiving, so that we keep the same level of training, and then that means we're able to work together well in the future. So that's just a very quick overview from my part for this, and look forward to the contributions that my Swedish and Ukrainian colleagues make. So thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for your input and for explaining what the EOP entails from a NATO perspective. I'm personally interested to find more about what other countries might become enhanced opportunities partners in the future during the Q&A session. We'll come back to this during the Q&A session. I would like to remind our followers that they can already type their questions in the sidebar of the live stream. We will now move to Northern Europe and bring to the discussion the perspective of Sweden as an enhanced opportunities partner of NATO. After 26 years of cooperation with NATO, starting with the Partnership for Peace back in 1994, Sweden was one of the 5 partners granted enhanced opportunities dialogue and cooperation at the Wales Summit 2014 already. Ambassador Wernhoff, what is your country's experience with the program, and what concrete benefits has it brought to Sweden?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here and being able to take part in this discussion, which I think is very important. And now when you approach a country which has this relationship to NATO, I think I would like to put it in a political and maybe also a geographical context. I don't know if you're familiar with Napoleon's words, but I think he claimed that you can never understand a country's behavior if you don't take a very close look at the map.
And
I
you
wish
did.
we had a map here, but maybe you can have virtual maps in your minds just to get a sense of the geographical situation in the corner of Europe where Sweden is, and Finland, and also I would say approaches where Ukraine is also situated, because that's really decisive. So there is a political and a geographical context to what we do and why we do things. And I'd like to make 4 very brief points, and then I'll be happy to take questions. And one is a historical point that I'd like to make. The other is on how important our relationship with NATO is and our partnership. And also specifically a little bit on the EUP and our purpose with the EUP, of course. And then also I'd like to just give a very brief overview on the public debate, because you can never forget that, about NATO in Sweden. That's what runs our political context, of course, and that should be the case. But if you look back a little bit, remember, please, that Sweden has conducted a policy of neutrality for 200 years, up to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then, all of a sudden, there was a historical chance to break out of this policy, which we found to be a fruitful policy, a logical policy, and a policy which served us well. But when the fall of the Soviet Union opened up new doors and a new Europe was about to emerge, Sweden joined the EU, which in itself was an act of shouldering up with other European countries. You might not be aware of it, but the EU discussions in Sweden before the fall of the Soviet Union always stumbled upon the fact that we were a neutral country, and then we could not join a club, because if you join a club, you have solidarity with that club. So one can say that our security policy changed from neutrality to solidarity. Eventually, it was also written and formulated in words, this change. And since 2008, we have a solidarity clause in our security policy doctrine, where we explicitly say that we will defend another EU country or a Nordic country. As you know, not all Nordic countries are members of the EU, if they are subject to an attack. We expect them to act the same towards us, of course, but we have this doctrine, and we take it very seriously, and then you have to prepare for that. So that's a very, very important axiom or a thesis in our approach to this. Now, of course, at the fall of the Soviet Union, when we started Partnership for Peace with NATO, it was not because we saw an imminent threat towards Sweden or our territory or to Europe. We considered that the potential threat which was posed by the Soviet Union was more or less gone and would not reappear. That's how naive we were, but that's history. But we joined the Partnership for Peace in order to be able to act with NATO and NATO countries in missions in third countries, Afghanistan, the Balkans. It started with the Balkans, actually. And exactly as James said, interoperability was the key word. It's a technical word, but it meant that our armed forces had to be able to work together with NATO armed forces, and standards, technical requirements, etc., had to be able to speak to each other. Now, of course, the world changed after 2014, or maybe it started even before that. And our aim of interoperability in order to conduct missions in third countries changed to interoperability for our own territorial defense and to help our neighbors in case of an attack from Russia or a conflict. And it's no secret. Talk about Russia here. So our ambitions on when it came to interoperability changed from certain parts of our armed forces basically to the whole of our armed forces, our total defense, you could say, our armed forces in total, all parts of the armed forces. And that is also one part of our individual program with NATO to achieve this interoperability. Basically, it means that all the lines and cords and contacts should be there, and in the case of a conflict, and if NATO so decides, and if Sweden so decides, two independent decisions have to be made. We can connect the cables, and the electricity, so to speak, should be able to flow effortlessly, seamlessly. And that's what we are aiming for, and we have come quite a bit on that road, but still things remain to be made. We signed a host agreement, nation host agreement with NATO 2 years ago, which means that we should have all the technical facilities to host NATO forces on our territory. And this goes down to nitty-gritty and all sorts of technical details. I will not go into that, but that's also an important part, and it has been formalized in a treaty, you could say. So NATO has, after 2014, become a cornerstone to our security. And the security in our region, the Baltic Sea. We cannot, from our Swedish conclusion is that if something happens in our region to our neighbors, be it NATO countries like Norway, Denmark, or the Baltic countries, or Finland, of course, Sweden will be, we cannot stay away from that conflict. And here you really need to take a good look at the map to understand this. And that's the conclusion, and that drives our efforts. We have also bilateral defense policy cooperations. We have a very close cooperation with Finland, which actually should be where we do planning together, and where we should be able to act together beyond peacetime. That's as far as you can go and say if you're a diplomat and not really signing a treaty. We are on the way to coordinate very closely with Norway also on the broad scale of armed forces. We already have a trilateral Air Force training program between Norway, Sweden and Finland, which is very pragmatic. There is no treaty behind it, but they basically practice together every day, and they could, in principle, if we also decide, work as one Air Force if need be. And that's a substantial Air Force if you put all those planes together. So we also have a bilateral agreement with the United States, and we have a trilateral agreement, Finland, Sweden and the United States. So there is a web of different defense relationships which we have concluded. So NATO, and this was also a conclusion by our foreign minister, who was, exactly as James said last week here in Brussels, speaking to the North Atlantic Council. When she left, she tweeted, "NATO is a key cornerstone for our defense policy." And this has become the fact after 2014 in a relatively short period of time, I would like to say. And this has also, just as a parenthesis, meant that we have also started to increase substantially our defense spending. I think in the next 5 years it will increase between 40 and 50%, which is the highest increase since the 50s in our country. Now, when it comes to the Enhanced Opportunity Partnership, our aim with that is, as I said, to get the interoperability going and working. It is not aimed for membership. That's very clearly stated. And that's very clearly the Swedish government's also, it's our position. And it is our view that not being a member of NATO actually facilitates stability in our region. But we need the close coordination, and we need to work together if we so mutually decide. And again, take a look at the map and ponder this. I think it would make it much clearer. Of course, this puts an extra, I would say, ambiguity to our relationship with NATO. There is a question mark hanging over our head. Will we act when need be? And will NATO actually make a decision if need be? I consider this ambiguity as a constructive ambiguity, as the case is now, because we show with our engagement in our dialogue with all our agencies which cooperate with NATO that we are very serious about what we are doing. But we do this without the formal treaty and without the formal guarantees. Now, finally, I'd like to also touch upon a little bit on the view of NATO in Swedish opinion. 2014 was a change. Up till then, we had around 25-27% of the opinion of the population was in favor of a NATO membership. After 2014, after Ukraine and Crimea, it rose to around 40-45%, and there it hovers. In the last poll that was made by NATO, I believe, you saw a figure of up to 60% of the Swedish population who are positive to NATO in general, not membership. And this is definitely a change, and this trend seems to manifest itself also in the political life. We have 4 political parties constituting around 35% of the votes who are openly in favor of a Swedish NATO membership. But there is no majority in parliament, and there is no majority in public opinion. And I would say, on a personal reflection, when you make a very important decision like that, you better be sure you have a solid majority. You don't want a harsh political domestic debate on issues like this, because once you decide to go for it, don't get it wrong.
Can I come back?
That's all I have to say right now.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador, for your insights and for sharing with us your assessment of NATO-Sweden relations. We will now move to Eastern Europe and bring to the discussion the perspective of another EOP country, Ukraine. Relations between NATO and Ukraine date back to the early 1990s and have since developed into one of the most substantial of NATO's partnerships. Since 2014, in the wake of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, cooperation has been intensified in critical areas, and on June 12 this year, the North Atlantic Council recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner. Mr. Tolkachov, what does this NATO upgrade mean for Ukraine, and what concrete benefits does it bring to your country?
It's my pleasure of being here and online and discuss this topic with you. 2014 was mentioned a number of times, 10 times, and for obvious reasons, when the Wales summit was in September, I think, and the initiative was introduced, there was ongoing combat events in Donbass after the illegal annexation of Crimea. The first time the European borders were changed by force, and international law violated. Russian directly invaded a part of Donbass, and at that time it wasn't just possible to talk about the interoperability. It was a time when you stopped the aggressor at the front line. And finally, this year we have received this decision. It's very positive. It's a recognition of a long-standing contribution of Ukraine to NATO's operations. We've been in Kosovo, in Afghanistan. We participated in naval operations, active endeavor, and the Ocean Shield. And since that time, by the way, you mentioned the host nation support MOU. We also had this in place. We were one of the first partners to join NATO response forces. And for us, the EUP status, it's purely meal-to-meal framework where we can develop an interoperability with, particularly right now, with this focus of newly created special operation forces. But in 2014, everything has changed, and Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO and the EU. This is, of course, anchored in our constitution. But we fully understand that advancing on the road to membership we need to conduct more reforms. Interoperability will give an added value to that. And with the development of the armed forces, with the further participation in missions around the world, even facing the threat still back at home. But we really looking for the options where we can fit and propose something to NATO and partners, not just to receive some additional assistance or training and advice, although it's important. And we will together develop additional fields of cooperation exercises. We would like to participate in cyber defense exercises, in Article 5 exercises, but it's up to NATO to decide. It gives military, the status gives military additional time planning for the training and exercise. This year, Alliance approved the program of exercise for 4 years, I think. So we already have an access to this list of exercises. We can do some advanced planning and work on different sites and exercises, and military exercises and training is very important for armed forces to be able to confront Russian Federation, basically. Well, I'll stop on that.
Okay. So now we will start the discussion. I would like to go back to James. So we heard that both Sweden and Ukraine are active contributors to Euro-Atlantic security through their participation in NATO-led operations and missions in Afghanistan, in the Balkans. They also participate in the NATO response force. Is the EOP status granted in recognition of a partner's significant contribution to NATO operations and mission? Is this the main criteria underpinning NATO's decision to grant this status to selected partners, first of all? If you can elaborate more on this, James.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, the very short answer to your question, yes. I mean, EOP status is... what we do is every couple of years, we ask our military authorities to prepare an analysis of the countries who contribute to NATO missions and operations. The NATO response force was mentioned, countries that have been very active in NATO exercises. They then send that analysis to our political committee, which then assesses whether they will grant this status going forward, or whether they will add a new country, which was done this year, where we decided politically that we will add Ukraine. But at the end of the day, the main criteria is this a country that contributes significantly to NATO operations and missions? And I think, as the ambassador said, as Georgiy said, that it's also of benefit to that country too. So they have to, NATO doesn't force this on them. NATO says, would you like to be an enhanced opportunities partner? And then that country says, yes, we'd like to keep doing that. But as I said, the main focus is on countries that have made a contribution, have given us particular forces, and which we feel we want to have very close to us in terms of being able to operate in the future.
Okay. I'd also like to ask you, James, and then we will move to the other speakers, if you can share more with us, why do Sweden and Ukraine matter to NATO? Why are they important for the organization? What's the added value they bring to NATO?
Sure. Well, I would say that there are three things that NATO values in the partnership, and obviously it's a very different partnership for each of the countries. Yes. But if I have to generalize at a very high level, there's three things. I'm going to steal the point that the ambassador made, okay, which is geography. Okay. If you look at geography, these countries are very important to NATO geographically. They are our neighbors, and what happens for their security has an impact on NATO's security. So that's number one. Number two is they are countries that share our values. So they are democratic countries that believe in upholding international law, that believe in rule of law and protection of human rights. And these are countries that we want to work with because they share our values. And the third point gets back to what I was just saying a moment ago, is these are countries that bring real capabilities to the table. They have very strong armed forces, they have unique capabilities, and they have been willing to share those capabilities with NATO in the past and currently. And so NATO values that because it allows us to have more forces to bring to bear when we go for peacekeeping operations.
Okay.
Thanks.
So let's discuss more about geography, and let us bring into focus the two seas, the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. The Baltic Sea security is a shared priority for both Sweden and Ukraine and NATO, and it is high on NATO's agenda. I would like to ask Ambassador Wernhoff, how is it possible to further strengthen the Baltic Sea security from a Sweden's perspective? And if you can tell us more about the role of the island of Gotland in this equation, and then we will move to Black Sea.
Well, I think first and foremost, you must understand where the Baltic Sea is geographically, and we've covered that. And what can be done to enhance security there? Well, many things, I think. One is, of course, predictability. Try to get some rules of engagement, deflecting instruments. I mean, we have incursions going on and provocative behavior which goes on, which is not helpful, can easily be turned into something quite negative if misunderstood, or if an event is being carried away in the wrong direction. So there you need to have a dialogue among all countries involved within the Baltic Sea region, and sharing as much information as you can, and particularly with your friends. That's one thing. And then you also need to sort of increase the threshold for a confrontation to take place. And that you do by having a sustainable and strong enough defense or armed forces and cooperation between the countries involved. And that's exactly what is going on also. So that is what you can do. You had a question on Gotland.
Yes,
Well,
if you can elaborate a bit more.
Take a look
on
at the
that.
map and you see where Gotland is, and if you just have sort of basic military training, you understand the strategic value of that island if something happens in the Baltic Sea or in the Baltic states or along the eastern rim. And also maybe taking into account the official doctrine of Russian defense, the bastion defense thinking. They want to, as far west they can go to defend their territory. Gotland is a stepping stone on that way, of course. So Gotland is important. But there are other islands also in the Baltic which are important
as
like
well,
Bornholm, for instance.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, if we can focus on the Black Sea, in terms of the focus of NATO, Black Sea has played a secondary role to the Baltic Sea. Correct me if I'm wrong, James. We're seeing a Russia's ongoing militarization of Crimea, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, alongside A280 challenges. My question for James and then for Mr. Tolkachov, what can NATO do to further increase its presence in the Black Sea? And for Mr. Tolkachov, what contribution could Ukraine make or have to the development of a NATO comprehensive strategy for the Black Sea region to counter Russia's military buildup?
Okay, thanks. I'll go first. So I think actually you have seen in the last several years, NATO has increased its presence in the Black Sea region. Maybe initially it was in the Baltic Sea region, but I think particularly since we saw the Kerch Strait incident and the violations that have been taking place in the Sea of Azov, NATO has worked very hard in the last couple of years to try and improve its posture in the region. And we have seen a significant increase in posture from the Russian Federation, particularly on the Crimean Peninsula. And so what NATO is doing is we have forces which are forward deployed in Romania, and we have increased the operational tempo of our exercises, and we have increased the number of port visits, and our standing naval forces are much more regularly in the Black Sea region. And we're working more closely with our two partners around the region, which is Ukraine and Georgia. And so between Ukraine, Georgia, and then NATO has 3 allies, which are littoral states, which is obviously Bulgaria, Romania, and Turkey. And so with those allies and those 2 partners, we have many of the littoral states, actually all but one, which are interested in trying to promote stability and security in the region. And so we've increased quite a bit our activity in the last couple of years, as I said, particularly since the Kerch Strait incident. And I think that's also something we're going to be exploring with our Ukrainian colleagues in terms of EOP. What can we do to further enhance Black Sea security going forward?
Thank you, James.
I would just add a little remark on your answer, yes. Contributions, it's yes. But it's also a political recognition of long-standing commitment to international security. It's not simply you just given assets. You are creating the international security based on rules, orders, and so on. And also the other point, why partnerships matters, and probably will partially add the question on Black Sea security. NATO partnerships is designed to project the security. And in case of Black Sea, Russian Federation created a military base in Crimea, from which it conducts operation in Syria and in Northern Africa. And also making the exercises and provocative military actions in the Black Sea itself. So we are ready to share the situational awareness with partners, littoral states, except for Russia, and to share intelligence. We see on site what's happening, and we are ready to provide this info to our partners in the Black Sea. This is shortly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tolkachov. Now I will take some questions from the audience and I will try to combine some of them. There's a question from Maria Solce, who is a YPFP member of our Brussels chapter. And Maria asks, both Sweden and Ukraine face hybrid operations from Russia. How do the 2 countries respond to them? And what can NATO do to help Sweden and Ukraine to counter hybrid threats and to improve the resilience of these countries? So I guess we could get the perspective from the Ambassador Wernhoff, from Mr. Tolkachov, and then James' input from a NATO perspective regarding hybrid operations from Russia.
Should I start?
As you wish.
There are definitely cyber attacks on Sweden from China and Russia, and this is also publicly acknowledged by our security institutions in Sweden. I mean, this is a new, this asymmetrical warfare, as I think the term is, that you can conduct activities through cyber or hybrid, which is maybe not clearly defined, but not using ordinary military means by disrupting a society. This is becoming the norm. And this is a new era we are entering in also, I think. So it's an extremely important, and it's a serious change, I think. If you have a scale from 1 to 10, 10 is a full-blown war, and 1 is peace and sunshine, I think we are always now at a state of 2 and 3. There is a constant conflict going on. This has resulted, at least in my country, in Sweden, that the government has just decided to establish a cyber agency in order to identify these threats. These threats or attacks can disrupt electricity, other public services, or other very important infrastructure, and create serious damage to society. Our armed forces have also set up a cyber command with a particular aim in protecting their own infrastructure from cyber attacks. So this is one way we are doing. I think this needs a lot of coordination and dialogue with NATO, with other partners, and with our neighbors, because it's extremely difficult also to identify who is actually conducting this and how can you respond. I think we are just in an initial stage in this whole process. That's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have created the NATO-Ukraine hybrid warfare platform to share our experience and lessons. It changes every day. Cyber attacks, we had a lot of them. We had the attack in 2015 on power plant. Then it goes on and on and on. Disinformation. Russian media always try to cover and show bad image of Ukraine. They find in cases which is often are not true, really not true, fake.
Fake news.
Yes, and it's always difficult to be very resilient against that, and but we are sharing our experience, trying to find ways where we can improve the resilience of everything, basically. State authorities, armed forces, security forces, everybody. This is a short answer. It's a very difficult question.
It's a very complex question, yeah. And I think that answers also the question from Ilko, because he asked in which areas does Ukraine have the expertise to share with NATO, and we already covered hybrid. So if we can get your input, James, from a NATO perspective.
Sure. I mean, we could probably do another 2 hours on hybrid warfare. Sadly, the Ukraine experience is actually what woke most of Europe up to the hybrid threat, because Ukraine was subject to a hybrid attack, which became an invasion of its country, and it's terrible that that's happened. But thankfully, Ukraine has offered to share its experience and its expertise with us. So Mr. Tolkachov mentioned we created in 2014 or 2015, we created the NATO-Ukraine hybrid warfare platform, which allows us to work as a community to try and better understand hybrid warfare. We do a number of tabletop exercises, and we try and identify and analyze new areas of hybrid that are emerging, because as both of the previous speakers said, it's constantly changing. I'm very pleased actually that Sweden and Finland joined that NATO-Ukraine hybrid platform this year. So they've just recently become members, so they will now be part of that community as well. Just to sort of take a step back in terms of hybrid warfare overall, NATO is a standard-setting organization for its allies. And so what we've done is we've tried to take a look at the experience Ukraine has faced, the experience Georgia faced, the experience that many of our member states and partners are facing, and we've tried to set new standards. What do you need to have in terms of security for your cyber systems, for your water supply, for your electricity grid, so that you can prepare yourself in case you face that kind of a challenge? And here I would certainly mention the Center of Excellence for Combating Hybrid Warfare, which is in Finland. And that is actually a center where both NATO and the European Union come together to talk about these issues, because NATO has a certain set of tools and abilities to be able to combat hybrid warfare. But obviously, the things we've been mentioning, electricity grid, water supply, healthcare system, information operations, that's not something that's only within NATO's purview. So it's critical that NATO and EU be able to work together effectively. And so we do that primarily through this center, which is a contribution of Finland.
Okay, thank you, James. There's also a question for you from Adrian Garcia Esteve from YPFP Brussels. He asks, what is the impact of the current armed conflict on Ukraine-NATO relations, and if Russia's presence and destabilization of Ukraine is a deal breaker when it comes to the country's NATO membership aspirations?
Okay, happy to do that. It's a question we get all the time,
Yes.
And I'm sure Mr. Tolkachov gets it all the time too. How does the ongoing conflict affect relations? I would say, if anything, it has made them stronger. because we've seen a couple of things happen. Number one is NATO has recognized the threat that Ukraine faces. And so we have a substantial set of assistance measures that we put in place to help Ukraine. We have, I think it's upwards of 50 people who are located in Kiev, experts, who work in the Ministry of Defense every single day. It's the NATO representation in Ukraine. So it's a two-way street. It's NATO sharing experience with Ukraine, but Ukraine also sharing experience with NATO. And it's not about NATO teaching Ukraine, it's NATO assisting Ukraine in Ukraine achieving its goals. These are goals Ukraine sets for itself, for the defense and security of its country, and NATO is working to help Ukraine with that set of goals. In terms of the question about membership, I think that we get asked this question quite often. I think the answer is, first of all, it has to be the interest and will of Ukraine. And I think Mr. Tolkachov said it is. It's enshrined in the Constitution, and so NATO supports that aspiration. In terms of the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, it will not be an impediment over the longer term, because then that gives a veto to Russia, which is the country which is causing this conflict in Ukraine. And so we have a number of examples. If you go way back, you look at West Germany became a member of NATO without controlling all of its territory. And so at the end of the day, though, it has to be a political decision on the part of the country that wants to come in, and a political decision on the part of the NATO allies. And I think Mr. Tolkachov himself said that Ukraine has a deep process of reforms underway, and it's attempting to meet the standards that are necessary to be a member of both NATO and the European Union. And precisely because we support that aspiration, we work with Ukraine every day to do that. So, it certainly is something which has an impact on our relations every day with Ukraine, but it's not something that we see as being an impediment long term. If Ukraine continues to work and proceed in terms of its reforms, and it meets all the standards for membership, then the country will eventually get the political decision necessary from the allies to become a member of NATO.
Thank you, James. Yes, please.
I'll just add to that this Saturday, Germany will celebrate 30 years of reunification, the fall of the Berlin Wall. So everything is possible.
Thank you, Mr. Tolkachov. We will move a bit now again to Sweden. There's a question from Isaac. At the NATO 2030 climate debate yesterday, the Secretary General Stoltenberg highlighted the impact of the climate crisis on military operational capabilities. How does the climate change impact the military environment around the Baltic Sea region? Perhaps you could elaborate from Sweden's perspective.
I honestly cannot tell.
Yes.
I mean, the sort of ever increasing of temperatures and how that affects the security situation in the Baltic Sea, I would maybe not draw too strong conclusions, but indirectly I can see changes. Even you have to go further north. I mean, if the situation in the Arctic changes rapidly, meaning that the ice will melt in the ice sea, and opening up sea routes, sea lanes, which will gather and gain a lot of interest from not only Russia, of course, which can control them, but also from China, who would like to utilize them basically for trade, but with that comes also a strategic interest for sure. This is a long-term perspective. It will take a long time before those trade routes will materialize, if ever. But if climate change continues, it will happen sooner or later. There I can see it. Otherwise, I think it is more indirectly consequences for us and what happens in other parts in the world because of climate change. There can be large migration flows which could affect Europe is already affecting Europe, maybe not because of climate, but that could very well happen, and that will put enormous strain on our societies.
There's also a question for you, Ambassador, from Federico Siracusa, who is a member of YPFP Brussels. He's asking if the vessel capability and the technological capability, such as intelligence, will be expanded in Sweden.
I'm not sure I understand the question, but there is a clear ambition to increase the Swedish capacity when it comes to information and intelligence gathering. You mentioned vessel.
Yes.
We do have a marine, and we do have submarines, which are also used for intelligence gathering, for sure. That will not be given up. That's defined as a very high priority area for our future defense. So that will continue.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, there's a question for James, again, from Ihor Ilko. He's asking, as NATO is aspiring to become more global politically, do you think new partnership formats will be created in the coming years, or will allies work to intensify work in the existing forums?
I'm glad that actually Ihor asked the question in terms of as NATO seeks to become more global politically, because I think it's a very important distinction to make. NATO is a regional security organization. It's a North Atlantic and a Euro-Atlantic organization. NATO is not seeking to become a global organization in terms of operating globally, and I don't know that we would ever have consensus among the allies for NATO to be acting globally. However, NATO sees that the security challenges we face today are global in nature. So if we see a challenge to freedom of navigation, or we see the challenge of climate change, or we see the challenge of cyber defense or cyber security, those are global challenges that do not respect borders and are not limited to one particular region. So what NATO seeks to become is an organization with global connections, an organization that politically has a relationship globally to be able to exchange information with countries. And a good example is another one of the enhanced opportunities partners, which is Australia. Australia is very far away from the Euro-Atlantic region. Okay, however, Australia has been a significant contributor to NATO operations for many years. And Australia has a very unique perspective on global security challenges. And so we work very closely with Australia and actually with our other partners in the Asia Pacific, Japan, Republic of Korea, New Zealand, in order to try and understand what's happening, what are the challenges in their region. And I will tell you that actually when the illegal annexation of Crimea took place and the start of the conflict in the Donbass region, Australia was actually one of the first countries to come forward and say, this is a matter of international law. International law has been violated, and we must stand up for this. So countries around the world see that what happens in Europe and Eurasia has an impact on their security. So it's very important that NATO understand what's happening, NATO be able to exchange information, and NATO be able to work with those countries when they need to. So.
Thank you, James. But this leads me to my first question. What other countries might become enhanced opportunities partners in the future, if we look also at that part of the world?
I mean, we would have to look and see which countries would be willing to contribute substantially to NATO operations. And so, as I said, there is at first, in the first instance, there is actually an assessment by our military colleagues of which countries have contributed across the full spectrum of NATO operations, what are the levels, how long have they been contributing, and so I can't really predict which countries might in the future become enhanced opportunities. I can tell you, though, that we have a robust political relationship with many countries, even those who are not enhanced opportunities partners. So we regularly meet with the 4 partners from the Asia Pacific that I mentioned. We regularly meet with them to talk about security challenges in their region and to talk about what impact that has on NATO's security.
Great. Now we have another question from Kieran Watkins, Corporate Affairs Manager at Smiths Group and a YPFP member. Again, a question for James. Does NATO engage with private actors such as industry to support its enhanced opportunities partners?
So I don't think actually that we have specifically done work with private industry. I mean, NATO engages with private industry quite regularly because we need to speak to industry about their new developments, what's coming onto the market, what are the needs of NATO missions and operations. And so we certainly have a very robust program of that. Many of our partners engage in cooperation with NATO in the Science and Technology Organization of NATO, or what we call the Conference of National Armaments Directors, which is where we set standards for NATO radios or NATO ammunition. And both Sweden and Ukraine are extremely active in those types of things. And so that is actually, it's not specific to the EOP program, but NATO has a very robust cooperation with the private sector, and our partners through plugging into those NATO programs also work with private industry.
Thank you, James. And now we move again to Ukraine. There's a question from Marina Otasevich from YPFP Brussels. Although it should be understood as an incremental approach, not a revolutionary one, as James already said at the beginning, the EOP status for Ukraine might provoke some reactions from Russia in short term, longer term. If so, how will Ukraine react, and what kind of mitigation measures NATO could employ? The second part of the question would be for you, Mr. Tolkachov, and then again for James.
Well, the status was granted on Russia's day.
Mm-hmm.
This is the answer. Simple answer. Who cares about what Russia is saying? Russia is an enemy for us. It's a threat. And we careless of what they're thinking. We're confronting them at the battlefield with weapons. So I don't have other answer for that.
Okay.
I think what I would say is that it's a fundamental principle for NATO that every country should have a right to choose its defense and security arrangements. And if that means cooperation with NATO, then that's what the country should be able to do. If that is to pursue membership in NATO, that is also a right. It's a fundamental right. It's in the Helsinki Final Act. It's the basic OSCE charter that countries should have and do have the right to choose their own security arrangements. And so NATO cooperation with Ukraine is on the basis of Ukraine's request for that cooperation. I do want to stress here, NATO is not seeking to have Russia as an enemy. We have mentioned it here many times. We believe that Russia has a very important role and very important part to play in European and Euro-Atlantic security. But it must be a Russia that does not invade neighboring countries. It must be a Russia that upholds international law and upholds its international commitments. But that doesn't mean that Russia is an enemy for us. It just means that Russia is a key part of Euro-Atlantic security, but we can't have a relationship of trust. We can't have a relationship of cooperation unless we have a Russia which lives up to international law and abides by its international commitments.
If I may add a bit on Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner for you, James, because we also have the NATO-Ukraine Commission, and I wonder if that complements or duplicates when it comes to the EOP, if you can elaborate a bit more on this, if possible.
Sure. I mean, the NATO-Ukraine Commission is actually the political framework in which all of NATO-Ukraine relations take place, and that remains still in place now. We've had that since 1998, I believe, I think was when we created the nuke. Forgive me if I'm wrong. You can all Google it at home and then type in that I'm wrong. I think it was 98. But that has for a very long time been the political framework that we've used for NATO-Ukraine political relationship. And so the political relationship has been there for a very long time. I mentioned the NATO representation in Ukraine, which is almost like a NATO embassy in Kiev, which works daily with Ukrainian counterparts. What I would say about EOP, and I think Mr. Tolkachov said this, is EOP is more of a technical thing. It's not a political thing. So it's about how do we make sure NATO and Ukraine are able to work together effectively? How do we keep our forces interoperable? But the political framework for the NATO-Ukraine Commission and Ukraine's annual national program through which it works on its reforms to prepare itself for membership, that's been in place for a very long time. And so EOP is essentially adding one more tool to the toolkit rather than sort of a whole new status or a new framework for cooperation.
Thank you, James. There's a question for Mr. Wernhoff. Does the enhanced opportunity status mean that Sweden would get or would be expected to give support from NATO in the event of a crisis in its vicinity?
No.
Short answer, no. Thank you.
As I said before,
Yeah.
there has to be a separate NATO decision on that for NATO to act and do things, and a Swedish decision also.
Yes.
Can I just add that
Yes.
that's what it means when you're not a member of NATO,
Yeah.
right? You retain your independence, and so just as the cooperation is, Sweden decides that it wants to cooperate, NATO decides that it wants to cooperate. It's the same. Any type of political statement or any type of action would be the same. It's a dual key system. NATO would decide, Sweden would decide. We would obviously be talking together in advance of that political decision, but it has to be a political decision on both sides because Sweden's not a member of NATO.
Yes. Before concluding, I'd like to wrap up with one final statement or comment from our speakers to allow our audience to leave with a practical takeaway. We will start in the reverse order with Mr. Tolkachov. What would you like our audience to take away from this discussion in 1 minute?
Oh, first that Ukraine will become a member of NATO someday. And I see very young people interested in international politics, in international security. It's very encouraging that there is a new generation which cares about the future. The climate change, you mentioned there will be artificial intelligence, space, and so on and so forth. So I wish everybody good luck.
Ambassador Wernhoff?
Very briefly, we have chosen a particular relationship with NATO, not with the intent of becoming a member, but that our engagement in that relationship, our engagement in exercises, our engagement in information and intelligence exchange, our engagement in the political dialogue, to show that we are prepared to shoulder our part of the responsibility for the security in Northern Europe. This is because of historical and geographical reasons we have come to this conclusion. But the intention is, of course, to collectively shoulder the responsibility for the security in our region.
Thank you, Ambassador. And James?
So I think a lot of times when we talk about think something like enhanced opportunities partners, and we talk about interoperability, it can sound really dry. You know, it's international bureaucracy. It's lots of NATO acronyms. You know, we're talking about can the radios talk to each other and can the planes fly alongside each other? What I would say is that yes, it's very boring and it can sound like a lot of jargon. But I think you need to think about what is the result, which is that when there is a crisis, can we work together quickly? Okay, and with both of these countries, we understand that we are living in a more challenging security situation, a dangerous time. One of the countries here is actually in active conflict on its territory. And so we need to be ready and to be able to act together when we want to. And so interoperability is two parts to interoperability. There's the technical side. Can the tanks work together? Can the radios talk together? But just as importantly is the political interoperability. Can you talk to each other? Do you share the same values? Do you have that habit of consultation so that when there is a crisis, you can work together? So you will hear a lot of these acronyms and a lot of these programs, but the point is, at the end of the day, are you ready to work together when you need to?
And you are.
We are.
Thank you, James. We have run out of time tonight, and I would like to thank everyone who followed along tonight for this discussion, as well as to my colleagues for their help during the organization of this event. Before closing, I would like to underline that you have the possibility to share your assessment of this event through a quick survey, which you can find at the end of the event. And the link will also be in the description of the YouTube and Facebook streams. We value your feedback, so please let us know what you think. Hope you will be able to further join us for our next YPFP's NATO series event on maritime security, which will take place on October 13. Please visit our website for further details. James, Mackey, Ambassador Wernhoff, and Mr. Georgiy Tolkachov, thank you for taking the time to join us for this technical but very interesting discussion on the EOP. Wish you the very best to you all, and see you next time.
Thank you for attending YPFP's live stream. We would like to kindly ask you if you can provide your feedback on the event through the following QR code or accompanying link, which is also provided in the description box below.